we present Beowulf, an original adaptation, written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Part 9. A Mother's Love. Darkness. That was all she felt now, and so darkness she would become. In a world of wrath and betrayal and violation and revulsion, there had been few lights to her life. He had been one. Now there were none, only darkness. Thick vapours of inky mist poured from within her, trailing behind her like an ebony veil. Her shoulders hunched towards her chest, her body straining to draw tears. She had no strength left to cry, and she wrapped the darkness around her like a shroud. Time passed. She did not know how long she sat there. Even now, as she looked around the cavern that was her home, she saw the marks his taloned feet had made, and she fancied she could almost hear him now, walking as he had once walked. No more, though. He would walk no more. She would make no more memories with him, and would forever be scarred by that final one. Her only son staggering forth into their home, bleeding and pale and one arm missing, mewling and wailing his wordless pain until he felt it no more. Until he felt no more. She did not know what to do. She did not know what she was without him to call on, without him to dote on, without him to care for and build her life around. He was all to her, and now he was no more. So did that not make her nothing? No, not nothing, not nothing. She had one thing left, one thing more to give, one thing more to birth into the world as she had once birthed her son. Vengeance. She threw her head back and howled a wordless cry, declaring her vengeance on all who had harmed him and hurling defiance on any who sought to stop her. Then she rose and made ready to seek out his killers and make an end of them. In the quiet hall of Hierot, Axel woke suddenly. A night of hard fighting followed by a night of hard drinking had both taken their toll, but at this particular moment it was his bladder that presented the most pressing need of all. Muzzily, groggily, he picked his way between the sprawled bodies of the Danes to find his way outside. The lamps in Hierot were shielded now, but still the contrast between the glowing inside and the darkness outside was extreme, and he stood for a moment blinking owlishly until the moon and stars lit the path before him. Away from the fires indoors, the sudden cold bit at him, and he reached back inside to pluck a discarded cloak and wrap it around himself, before stumbling off to answer nature's pressing call. A few moments later, and feeling much relieved, he trailed unhurriedly back towards the hall. The glowing fires inside were inviting, but the moon and stars were beautiful that night, so he chose to take his time. A sudden scurrying sound to his left startled him, and he pivoted smoothly, reaching for the long knife at his belt. But all that greeted him was the shamefaced gapes of a young couple in search of a quiet spot for a moment of romance together. Grinning at them broadly, his hand dropped from his knife, and he stepped out of their path. "Please," he said politely, "don't let me disturb you. Go on your way." Smiling brightly back at him, the young lovers hurried off together, clasping hands tightly and giggling to each other. "Go be young," he thought after them, "and enjoy that fun and freedom while it lasts." It felt like just yesterday that he had been one of them, carefree and love-struck, the world spread out before him. Somehow, though, after facing that creature with Beowulf the night before, Axel's world felt smaller and infinitely more dangerous. He thought of Gunnar, who had been taken from them in a moment as sudden as a heartbeat, and he thought how abruptly it could all be over. Perhaps he should be stealing more moments of passion like those two young lovers, and wringing all the joy out of life he could. For now, though, he was content to sit back and stare at the stars. Except they were no longer there. She had arrived. The trail had been easy, though it broke her heart to follow. It was marked out for her by her son's own blood, his life spilled richly to guide her on. Here before her, though, was the great hall, the one her son had claimed and made his own. The stink of menfolk was all over it, but beneath their infesting presence she could still scent him there. Standing in the darkness, it glowed like a beacon, but it would not glow for much longer. Closing her eyes, she breathed out slowly, weaving a cloak of darkening mist and sending it questing forth before her. Soon, oh so soon, she would stand among the mortals, and she would become death. Axel blinked up at the sky, certain his eyes must be to blame. The stars had been there moments before, with the silvery moon in a cloudless sky. No longer. He waved his hand before his face, but he could not even see it. A knot formed in his belly as he realized something was wrong, very wrong. Behind him, in the great hall of Hierot, the light grew dimmer as a lamp winked out. Spinning around and stepping to the doorway, he saw another and another. From the edges of the room where people slept, the shimmering shadows on the wall seemed to grow and spread. As he watched, they began to crawl up the timbers like vines of smoke, trailing and mingling to form a shroud of shadow. "Beowulf!" he called out, his voice rising to a yell as he ran inside. Standing in the centre of the hall, he saw the last lamp go dark, and the whole of Hierot was lit by the dying embers of the fires. The deep amber glow seemed to add more accent to the shadows than banish them. "Beowulf!" he yelled again, and from across the room he saw his lord stir and sit up groggily. He did not know what to tell the man or how to explain the kind of attack they were under, but at that moment he was spared the need to, as a shriek rang out from a corner. In the depths of the shadows, a man's voice cried out briefly and was silenced, the sound replaced by a wet, splattering gurgle. Then another cry went up on the other side of the room and was again muted by that choking, bloody rasp. Then another, and another. Wherever there were shadows, Danes were dying. "Awake!" Axel yelled at the sleeping Danes, kicking them out of their slumber. "Get to the fires!" From across the hall, Beowulf had the same idea and was shaking people from their sleep. "Wake up!" he yelled as he made his way to the king and queen. "We are attacked!" From all around the room, Danes began pouring forth, huddling around the floundering fires. Axel grabbed hold of a stool and smashed it against the ground, picking up the pieces and feeding the fire. "Light!" he told the Danes, thrusting another stool towards one of them. "We need light!" Beowulf was fully awake now. There's nothing quite like the threat of death to really bring a man to consciousness, no matter how much he's had to drink. "Awake!" he yelled at the Danes as he darted across the hall. Stealing a glance to his left, he saw that Axel was already building up the flames. Good man, he thought, and he started shoving folk towards him. "Arm yourselves! Get to the fires! Do not stay in the shadows!" He reached the king and queen's platform and was relieved to find that they were already up and moving in the right direction with their sons, led by Unferth and Ashera. "What is this fresh hell, creature?" Ashera asked him as he hurried across. "I do not know," Beowulf replied, "but it brings darkness and it brings death." "How can we even fight such a beast?" Unferth asked. "I do not know," Beowulf confessed, "but we shall surely find out together." "Make way for the king!" he yelled to the crowd of Danes, and they drew Hrothgar and Walthio into the glow of the firelight. Axel had built the fires up now, their flames driving back the shadows, and from around the room, warriors were bringing swords and spears, their shining edges adding more light to the gloom. From the edges of the crowd, Beowulf and his men, along with Unferth and his warriors, strained their eyes into the darkness, desperate to see what it was that hunted them. From the shadows she stalked them. Menfolk. They babbled and chittered in their own tongues she had long since given up learning. Why bother? These creatures were here in one day and gone in the next, their words going along with them. She was old. She was age itself. In days gone by, these creatures had bowed to her in worship. She would not change herself for them. She danced around the light of their flames, careful not to get too close, and watched for anyone foolish enough to step into the shadows, to step into her shadows. To her dismay, though, they were no fools, and their fires were only building higher. She would go, then, and return another night. Her vengeance would not be hurried, and all menfolk must walk in darkness at some time in their short lives. She, however, had all the time in the world. She turned to go, and she saw it. There, above them, nailed to the timbers of the hall, was her son's arm, cruelly ripped and wrenched away from him. These menfolk, these insects, saw fit to brandish this as a prize, to display it as a trophy. White-hot fury burned within her, and all grief was momentarily washed away. This could not be borne. She let out a shrieking cry and hurled herself towards the Old One at the centre of their huddle, their leader, their lord. A wailing scream of indignant fury echoed in the hall around Beowulf, an unholy, unnatural scream, high and piercing and filled with fury. The very sound of it seemed to strike at them like a slap, and the crowd of Danes and Geats huddled tightly together. Then a howling sound like a rushing wind whistled about them, and the shadows began to swirl. As Beowulf tracked them, they seemed to coalesce to a single point. High above them he saw a form, a figure take shape in the smoky darkness. Tall and lithe and shapely, shadows pulsed around the figure like great wings, and without warning it dove down right towards the centre of the crowd, right towards the king. Beowulf fought to get through, but the Danes were too tightly clustered, holding together in the firelight. "Uncle!" he yelled impotently, and the shadow struck. For a moment, all was darkness. Then suddenly, the shadows were gone. Oh, there were still shadows in the room, but they were the normal and natural shadows in their proper place. The creeping, smoky black of the attack had left them, and with it was gone the severed arm of Grendel from the rafters. None of that mattered to Beowulf, though, as he pushed his way through the crowd to get to the king. "Uncle!" he cried, and his heart soared when he heard a response. "I am here, boy," the old man called. As he finally pushed through the crowd, though, he saw the king was far from looking relieved. Instead, he looked anguished and aghast. "What is it, uncle?" he asked the man, scanning quickly and seeing that Waltheow and both their sons were gathered together safely. "What did the shadow creature do?" "Ashura," said the king in a plaintive cry. "It has taken Ashura." Thanks for listening. Beowulf was a Settle Stories commission, written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Story editor was Miriam Sarin. Intro music was Warrior by Hartsman. Outro music was Travel in the Ocean by Monument Music. It was a Parable Arts production.